Welcome to Seekers and Finders, the podcast where we explore the infinite pathways to truth, creativity, and connection.
You know, before we get into any of the individual threads, there's a chapter that talks about there's a handful of kind of basic practices that I think people should have under their belt before they take up spirituality in general. And these are focused on well-being, on just like health and well-being. And it's actually, I think these practices are probably what most people are actually looking for out of spirituality. And so in the book, I say, I have this metaphor running of like, we're going on an exploration, we're going on a hike, we're going on a camping trip. And so I say in the book, like, if that's what you're looking for is health and wellness, this is all you need. Just do these practices, adopt them as your lifelong kind of, spiritual tools. And you don't need to proceed any further with the book into any of the other deeper practices. And these practices are mindfulness. Mindfulness for health and stress reduction is one. The second one is grounding practice for your body, just being able to down-regulate, just be able to bring yourself back into your body and relax when you're feeling overstimulated or overcharged. And then there's the basic practice of ethical kindness or nonviolence and non-harm. And then finally, sort of a philosophy of going with the Tao. So not just going with the flow and not contradicting or going against your nature or against the nature of things. So these kind of 4 practices, I would say, are great advice for basically anybody in any kind of situation to take on and to embrace. And then, they're not going to lead to profound, they're probably not going to lead to some kind of profound, potentially destabilizing sort of spiritual experience. But over the long term, they're really going to bring a lot of reduction of suffering, reduction of stress, and more happiness and well-being in your life. So I think most people are actually looking for that, and they should just do that and not move to the more advanced practices that do involve deconstruction of the narrative self or the ego self, and getting into more potentially dicey territory and mystical experiences and other things that can be destabilizing.
Okay, our guest today, back again for another stint with Seekers and Finders, is Pierce Salguero. And last time we just covered the surface. We looked at the book, his new book, great new book. I read it. I think it's great. A Lamp Unto Yourself, A Beginner's Guide to Asian Spiritual Practices. Today, we're going to, and we just touched the surface. So today, we're going to explore, and I think you have a new book in the works, and it's called Threads of Awakening. Yes. And I printed out 2 of my favorite threads of awakening, the emptiness thread and the oneness thread, so we can cover that. So Pierce, bring us up to date. What did we cover last time, and where do we want to go today?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me back. I'm happy to be here with you guys, and looking forward to jumping in a little bit. So I think last time we covered more kind of like the general philosophy that the book is kind of advocating, right? This multi-dimensional kind of do-it-yourself approach to spirituality, and we talk about why somebody might want to do that. And then I think what we said towards the end of the conversation was that we might want to have me come back and actually go into the content of the kind of this multi-threaded model that the book is advocating, and that my next book will detail even further. So the next book is just still in in a very preliminary form. I think I have about 50 pages written out of what eventually would be 200. So what you have there is kind of like a preview. Um,
Right.
that
So
and that Yeah, go
I
ahead.
have 56 pages, and it's called Threads of Awakening, a multi-dimensional map of the spiritual journey. So that's your next book. We've got 56 pages, and you're going to develop it. And so, but
Yeah.
today we have enough material to explore uh, further in depth what we just kind of covered on the surface with our initial podcast.
Yeah, and it's really both books, it's sort of like the beginning introductory kind of book, and then the more kind of a book that's pitched more for people who have been involved in spiritual practice for a long time. Maybe they're in kind of an awakening process already, and it's sort of like a more advanced treatment of a similar framework, similar material. So yeah, so the idea is I don't use the word threads in the first book. There's a different metaphor running through the lamp unto yourself. It's sort of a metaphor of like exploration and we're going hiking, so it's paths and are the metaphor in that book. Threads are the metaphor in the second book. But the main idea is the same in both cases, which is that the world's religious traditions, spiritual traditions, have developed really valuable tools and perspectives and philosophies that we can kind of divide up into different buckets or different threads or paths or different categories of spirituality that lead to different kinds of phenomena, lead to different kinds of awakenings, you could say. And that some people might be more inclined towards one or the other and may find more ease and facility with one or the other. And I'm kind of advocating diving into all of the above simultaneously in an integrated way in order to kind of discover, where your strengths are and where your inclinations are before committing to one or another tradition that may or may not be kind of a good fit for what you're naturally configured towards. And so the Lamp Unto Yourself book is really focused on Asian spiritual traditions. And so in that book, I introduced 3 out of 4 of the threads because the fourth one is not so well defined in Asian traditions. The second book comes out, it introduces the fourth thread and then kind of goes more in depth. And so the kind of the categories or the threads or the paths that are identified are one is a path of non-duality, non-dual perception. Actually, I make the argument that all of these paths wind up in a non-dual place, just different kinds of non-duality, which is something that we can talk about. But so the first path is a path of sort of using the mind to see through concepts, to see through the dual way of thinking and conceptualizing, and to arrive at a understanding of non-dual perception. The second path is a path of the heart, path of oneness, path of unity, a thread of oneness or unity that relates to kind of heart opening and devotional kinds of experiences. And the third path is the path of working with energy, energy within the body, energy within the world, and the relationship between the two, both mental and physical energies, yogic practices and Taoist practices and so forth. And then the fourth thread, the one that's not in the Asian book, but is in the second book, is what I call the psyche. And this has to do with a large category of different kinds of models and practices that relate to unearthing the shadow material, the unconscious material within the depths of the psyche, and bringing those out into the foreground. And models like Jungian based models, as well as other forms of indigenous traditions and shamanism and so forth, tend to focus in that area. And so I talk about, these 4 general areas of practice, different types of practices that relate to each one of these areas, different ideals for where you'll wind up. Sort of the enlightened person within an emptiness focused or non-duality focused tradition will be different than the notion of enlightenment within a open-hearted, unity focused tradition, and so on through the rest of the threads. And yeah, so really kind of treating these as four separate domains or approaches, but then really advocating that people taste, sample from all four of them, work with all four of them to see what kind of openings you yourself are able to have, on the basis of different types of practices.
Let's complete the sequence because I'm reading your table of contents, and the new book will be called Threads of Awakening, a multidimensional map of the spiritual journey. So you have an introduction, and you just kind of went through the four different threads: emptiness, oneness, energy, psyche. Now you have three more sections in the book, and I want to cover all of them. So then you have something called braiding, and then you have another section called integrating, and then the final section, which perhaps I am most interested in, and that's called releasing. So let's try to cover everything, but we want to explore, like we didn't do last time, in depth. We want to go a little in depth here with some, or if we have enough time, all of the threads. My own bent, and I'm just speaking for myself, I'm more into the emptiness thread than I am in the other. The next one would be oneness. As far as energy and psyche, they don't grab me. But Stefan may have another, and anybody else may have a different, orientation, and so we can see. But let's explore some of this in depth, and then let's see what braiding is all about. Let's see what integrating is all about, and let's see what releasing is all about.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, so you talked about your interest in the first of these areas. So in one book it's called Non-Dual Perception, and the other book it's called the Emptiness Thread. In both of those cases, the types of practices that are kind of oriented towards seeing through concepts, seeing through the subject-object duality in the way that we normally perceive things, having that perceptually drop away. So meaning through your senses, through your vision, your hearing, your body sensations, and through your thinking. So here we're talking about a whole wide range of different practices, from Advaita, from different forms of Buddhism, different types of meditations and self-inquiries, and also contemporary models like Headless Way and other kinds of more recent developments in spiritual practices. But essentially, in the Lamp Unto Yourself, I'm talking about kind of several different approaches to overcoming that subject-object duality. And so the first one would be to, this is primarily found, I think, within Advaita circles, would be to, if you have the subject and the object in your standard human way of seeing things for most people is that they have a feeling that I'm here and objects are there, and I am looking at an object, that there's this kind of what we call a duality between the subject and object. And so in Advaita and in similar types of practices, what you're trying to do, you might call it a negation path, or it's a neti path, where you are initially the subject and object are fused together in your identification, and you are withdrawing the subject from the object by pointing out all the things that you are not. And this will the goal is to have the objects to your identity to withdraw from the objects, such that you're left with a realization or an experience of I am awareness. So you've withdrawn the identity from the sort of everyday self, the everyday narrative self, the egoic self, as people often refer to it, to a meta level self or a meta level observer or witness that is awareness or consciousness or I am God. Some people will say, but there's a with a resolution of the subject object duality by reorienting your identity onto the subject, and the object falls away. I don't know if that maybe resonates with you because I'm saying it in maybe a way that is
Resonates with me 100%.
okay. So then that's the opposite of what most forms of Buddhism do. So most forms of Buddhism are actually advocating going in the other direction, which is to withdraw the identification from the subject. So it's the opposite move. And so here you wind up by withdrawing the identification from the subject. So you're withdrawing the identification I am. You're withdrawing the identification with I, and what you're left with is just objects. So anything that you would have identified as a subject now is seen to be another object arising within a field of objects with no subjectivity in the field. And so the way that you'll hear Buddhists refer to this, I mean, one really common way is to refer to the Bahia Sutta, which is a text that talks about in the scene, there's only the scene. So in the herd, there's only the herd, meaning there is no hearer or there's no seer that can be found, right? So you've eliminated the subjectivity from the field and you only have objects left. So you have sensory impressions, you have phenomena without an observer, right? So one is you go in one direction, you're left with the pure observer with no objects. The other is you go the other direction, you're left with a whole field of objects with no observer. Both of those are types of non-duality. They're kind of opposite types of non-duality, you might say, opposite directions that these two traditions take with regard to non-duality. And I present both of those in the book as being sort of viable starting points for for experiencing non-duality.
My question is it a mental shift? Because the one thing that I want to investigate a little further is in Hindu spirituality, there's the attainment of levels of samadhi where you transcend this normal state of being or understanding and you rise into a more transcendent state where not only your mind becomes illumined, but your whole being becomes immersed in this state, which I guess there's no words for. It's beyond even a state of bliss. So how does this state of non-duality, where is the, if any, where is the direction? How is the mind moving, shifting into this state? Is it a belief? I mean, can you explain that further?
Yeah. But maybe we should have started there, which is to say that the shifts that I'm talking about are in the Lamp Unto Yourself. The chapter is referring to this as non-dual perception, not non-dual thinking, not non-dual philosophy, not non-dual ways of speaking, but non-dual perception. So it's an actual perceived experience of reality. It feels like a shift in the way that reality is being perceived. Many people will create or construct a philosophy out of the experience, right? So they'll have the experience of I am awareness, and then they'll wind up sort of extrapolating a philosophy of, oh, so therefore there is only consciousness in the universe and everything else is, know, everything else is an illusion, or maybe some other version of a philosophy that is derived from the experience. So these religious traditions do create entire worldviews, cosmologies, philosophies, ontologies out of these experiences. But here, what I'm referring to is the actual experiences themselves. So in the book, I make a big deal, actually, in both books, about making the point that I'm not taking any stance whatsoever on what reality is. What I'm just describing is the kinds of experiences that people are able to have by doing these kinds of spiritual practices. So, what reality actually is like is not the concern of this book. So I'm talking about, actual shifts in experience and perception that people have by doing these practices. That's what I'm referring to primarily.
So the concept of God and spirit really doesn't play um, in this form of non-duality.
Well, people's language is very slippery, and the one of the things I talk about towards the end of the Lamp book is how the spiritual community or spiritual scene, you could say, in the West is very heavily influenced by Asian traditions, but primarily is using English language terminology to refer to things. And so there's a lot of slippage between how people are translating terms, what they mean by certain English terms, because did they translate that, is that pointing to a Sanskrit term from Hinduism, or is it pointing to a Chinese term from Taoism, or is it pointing to a Japanese term from Buddhism, right? And these get really mixed up. And so I don't think, so I think people can use all kinds of English words to refer to any one of these threads. So in when I'm, in the book and when I'm talking with people, I'm often much more interested in their description of the phenomena than I am in which words they're using. So somebody could say, when they have the non-duality shift towards the subjectivity side that you get in Advaita and forms of Hinduism, they could say, I am God. They could say something like, I am Brahman, right? And translate that as I am God. That could be their language that they use. Um, and that would be quite different than the what they mean by God if they're talking about the oneness thread, which is the next thread that we'll talk about in a little bit. They could be referring to something quite different, but using the same word as somebody else. In the first form of non-duality that I talked about, which is the subjectivity is left, then you know everything in the universe is the same subjectivity, right? Everything is I am is the only last standing reality in the universe, right? Within that kind of experience, um, the I part of I am can get very, very, very thin, so that it's not like a solid witness or like a solid identity. There's just maybe like a very thin kind of presence, you could say, or amness, right? Or a very, very light kind of almost imperceptible, just sort of uh, presence to the universe, and that's all that's left. Um, or you can be on the object side of non-duality, where the objects, so that the subjectivity drops out, and you have the objects are left, and the objects become more and more mirage-like, more and more less and less solid, less and less substantial, right? So the object side is getting thinner and thinner and thinner. The point is, in on this thread, or in this kind of like category of experiences, people tend to move towards deeper and deeper kind of experiences of that hollowing out or emptying out of experience. And so if they're on either the subject side or the object side first, soon or sooner or later the other side will empty out as well, right? Leading towards what in the um, in Sanskrit is referred to as experiences like Nirvikalpa Samadhi or Nirodha, or in English, we refer to this as cessation, which is kind of like the dropping out of both subject and object, right? Leaving kind of like either nothing or leaving just a complete blank. It's sort of like you know, a void in your memory and your experience and your consciousness where it just kind of like blinks out. And this is kind of like, I would say, the end of the emptiness path or the non-duality path, where it's like, there's non-duality. There's a lot of different ways that people are using the term non-duality. One is for resolving everything into awareness or consciousness or subjectivity. The other is for resolving everything into objects, where there's no viewer. And then another term, another understanding of non-duality might be that both collapse and there's just like nothing, right? That could be another
So,
um, form
okay.
of non-duality.
So two things. One, is there a practice to get there? And two, when you do get there, is it like being transparent, where people could look at you and see right through you? I mean, is it like you just become blended into the background of the universe, and there is no essence of you anymore in that mindset? And how do you get there?
Yeah, some all the ways that you just described, I've definitely heard people use to try to put words around this. Like as you said earlier, all of these experiences are really, really subtle and difficult to put into words. And everything I'm doing here is just sort of like, intellectually trying to explain it is kind of not doing justice to it, right? It's as if I was trying to explain to you what it's like to experience, I don't know, some delicious new food that you've never tried before. There's no way I could convey the actual experience to you other than just saying, well, it's kind of like this, it's kind of like that, right? So that's the best we can do here. But yeah, the the non-reality of things can become quite palpable on this thread, right? And things can seem very mirage-like, very sort of gossamer-like, very kind of almost even, like you said, invisible or disappearing. Reality can seem, not to be real, in many respects. And just as an aside, in the book, I talk about the potential dangers of people. I know this is another topic you want to talk about in a future podcast, so I won't go into it in depth here. But just I'll say that people can wind up very surprisingly and unexpectedly deep in this thread. Some people, it's a very gradual process where they deepen into the thread over time. Other people just kind of like maybe jump to a quite late stage and then kind of bounce back and move around a little bit. And if you find yourself kind of jumping all of a sudden to the deeper ends of this thread where things just really seem unreal and you can't find yourself anymore, that's often a recipe for people to describe, a spiritual crisis or a spiritual emergency, that they're just not ready for this kind of experience. It's happening too quickly. So that's just a kind of an asterisk or footnote to put on that. We can talk about that next time I come back.
I'm a seeker. I come down your street and I knock on your door and I say, Pierce, teach me how to achieve non duality. What are the steps?
Yeah, yeah. I was just going to say that. So the book, Lamp Unto Yourself, I introduce each one of these. I introduce four different types of practices that are intended to aim at four different types of non-dual experience. So the first one, kind of, standard Advaita self inquiry. It is kind of the most recommended for the I am experience. Buddhist style Vipassana meditation is kind of like the gold standard for experiencing the collapse of the self and or anatta, they call it in Buddhism, non-self, and the what remains are the objects. Um, then there is concentration meditation, whether in Buddhist or Hindu varieties, that are aimed at the cessation experience, like stopping the consciousness from happening, or just like dropping out both subject and object simultaneously. So that's various kinds of samadhi practices, jhana practices in Buddhism, and then I talk about a fourth style of practice, which is found, as far as I know, it's probably found in other traditions too, but I think it's most well known in the West through its Zen and Tibetan Buddhist varieties. You also find it in classical Taoism. And this is a practice of just sitting and doing nothing. So it's called just sitting in Japanese, Shinkantaza, and it's a way of um, realizing that the dualism between subject and object is created by mental process. And so if you're able to sort of sit and do nothing, the mental process can wind down, and the dualism of subject and object just can disappear without needing to dissolve one or the other or both, right? It can just kind of like it can just go away through the cessation of your thought process. So these are kind of four, I would say, gold standard practices. There's a ton of practices that could lead in this direction. But since the book is introducing Asian traditions, and I want to sort of introduce the greatest hits of Asian practices, I introduce these four practices as being sort of like the ones that I recommend. The book has instructions on how to get started practicing those. If I'm sure your listeners probably have a lot of experience with a lot of these practices, and they wouldn't necessarily need that. But if they're people that are listening that have never tried, Buddhist style Vipassana, let's say, what's that all about? There's a little box that describes it, and then I also have a series of instructional videos that are 5 minutes a piece that introduce all of the main practices, 20 basic practices. And that's up on the accompanying website for both books, which is multidharma.net. And so on that website, there's a kind of I'm just getting started page, and those
And I would say buy the book. You got these nice little boxes. You can get into Vipassana practice. You can get into the just Shikantaza, just sitting practice. Very great instructions. They're direct. They're to the point. Easy to do. Good stuff.
Yeah, thanks.
And there are clues in every practice, and the clues that you give may resonate better than other clues people have found in similar practices.
True.
Just listening to you right now, the clue that you gave me about the sitting meditation, which I've actually, that's helped me a lot. I mean, I'm living in Vermont now, so, it's winter time for the most of the time here. And I'm inside a lot, and I'm sitting a lot. And I'm just not using my mind that much. I'm just sitting and appreciating the silence, the emptiness. And I find that exactly what you said, my mind just becomes empty, and I'm just there. So if that's part of non-duality, I guess I've touched on it a little bit.
Yeah, I would say so. And then I would just say also, like, there are so many practices for a reason. It's because different kinds of practice work better for different kinds of minds, different kinds of people, and somebody like yourself, if you're living in a quiet environment, you don't have a lot of mental activity going on, Um, you may sit and find yourself and find this to be something quite easy to slip into. Somebody else might be living in a different kind of environment, really busy, very active mentally. And for them, just sit and do nothing. All they would do is just sit and kind of like think all the time. And it may not be so productive. And maybe they need a more structured kind of practice, right? And so that there's a whole range of different practices, and my very strong position is that it's not like just one of them is the right practice for everybody. Everybody has to experiment around. We talked about this last time, but that's the whole philosophy of the book, is everybody has to kind of experiment around and see what works for them, what resonates for them, what actually results in having these kinds of experiences for them. Because if you spent months and years working on one of these and never really got anywhere, then maybe it's time to switch it up and try another one. So anyway, for each one of these threads, there's a handful of different practices that you can try.
So the next thread you want to talk about,
Right. So you want to
and the
talk about
practice?
you
Yeah.
want to talk about the what in the lamp unto yourself is called the heart, exploring the heart, exploring the path of the heart. But in the second book is called the Oneness thread. So these are radically different in their orientation, very, very different priorities, very different kind of mindset, very different kind of, when people create ontologies and philosophies and worldviews out of the experiences, they create very different types of constructs out of these experiences. I think it's helpful to think of this as a separate sort of cluster of spiritual realizations, although they might combine in one or another individual with the non-dual. So somebody could be working on non-duality and then also have these oneness experiences, and for them they can be quite braided together, which we'll talk about later. But I think for thinking about things, it's best to separate them out and see them as separate kind of orientations. So if the non-duality orientation was mostly at neti, or like seeing through things, stripping away things, emptying things out, this path is more about including. It's both and both and both and so the practices here have to do with increasing the intimacy, the welcoming, also the embracing or the incorporating of more and more and more of reality into sort of a unity, a unification, or a oneness. And so a range of different practices here. First thing I want to say is it's entirely possible that you are practicing some practice out of the emptiness thread and you wind up having experiences that relate to the oneness thread. That happens all the time. People go into a practice thinking they're pointed in this direction, and suddenly they're landing over there, right? That happens all the time. But there are practices that are specifically oriented in this direction, that are intended to move you in this direction. And again, there's a whole wide range of them, but the book just introduces kind of the basic gold standard, most popular practices in Asian traditions. So here the usually the first step with this kind of practice is to try to open your heart emotionally, and so this is done through emotion based, love based practices, or devotion based practices, which is a similar, or gratitude based practices, another similar kind of emotional approach. So generally speaking, you could say this trajectory is similar to the emptiness trajectory, in that, people have initial experiences and they kind of like deepen into it, and it becomes more and more intense. It becomes more and more deep as people progress. So you progress from more kind of emotional feelings of intimacy or love, which is like maybe an experience of like, oh, I love all beings, or I love the planet, I love all beings in the universe, or something like that. It's more emotional and personal, to more impersonal experiences where it's not me loving the world, but rather just there is a whole field of love that I'm immersed in. Um, and then, but there's still a little bit of separation there, and then there's the dissolving of the self into that field of love. So there just is there just is a field of love, and I'm not separate from it. There's just this field of divinity, or this field, a lot of people would say God, that and I'm not separate from it. I'm just a part of it. Um, Eventually, at the furthest end of this thread, I would say there's kind of an experience of even, the that I am here seeing the love, because that separation, which is quite subtle, becomes too much, and it's the observer of the love, the witness of the divinity, or the separate kind of presence that sees that divinity, collapses into the divinity, and there's just nothing left other than the one. People will say the absolute, the ground of being, God, all kinds of other synonyms for that.
So
Let
you
me stop
mentioned
there.
gratitude. You mentioned gratitude and devotion, and the experience of gratitude can be felt as an overarching thing rather than to devotion to something or someone, where you're just immersed in that feeling of gratitude the
That's
same
right.
way you would be immersed in the feeling of unconditional love, where there isn't a subject that you're directing it to or an object you're directing it to. You're just immersed in the feeling of it, right? Is that correct?
Precisely. Yeah. Yeah. So however you open it initially, again, there's different practices aiming in different using different emotions to do this. There's different differences between different traditions, how they want you to do this, but essentially, yeah, the pattern goes from an emotional opening to a less personal experience, where the self just gradually, or quickly fades into the field, and then you're just left with the field. um so the practices here are, again, just kind of, I mentioned some gold standard, basic practices here. So one of the ones that I introduce is the Metta Bhavana meditation from Theravada Buddhism, which is about extending loving kindness, to yourself and to other beings, eventually to the whole cosmos. Then there's Tonglen, which is a Tibetan version of that practice, which would be to, you pull the suffering of the world into your body, and you visualize it transforming into love, and then extend it out back into the world. So there's this kind of like, it's in sync with your breathing and visualization. So you're kind of bringing in the suffering of the world and putting back out love and well-being and peace. So then there's another practice, which is more like a gratitude practice, where I talk about interacting with spirits, or with beings, unseen beings, disembodied beings. So extending your relationship with these kinds of beings, and having an intimacy and a gratitude and respect and love for them. And that's super, super common Asian religious practice. Basically, every one of these Asian traditions has a whole sort of like series of understandings about ancestors in particular, also just nature spirits and other kinds of spirits that people interact with on a regular basis. And another practice that's in there is what I call a surrender ritual, or surrender prayer, which is sort of um, giving over control of your life and your spiritual path and your fears and your anxieties, and your giving that over to a higher being of some sort. So different traditions, again, will have different understandings. In Buddhism, and maybe you're giving yourself over to a Buddha, to a Bodhisattva. Maybe in Hinduism, it's various gods and goddesses. A lot of these traditions have gurus. They have other kinds of, kind of idealized higher entities that you're sort of like, relinquishing the control and you're letting go of sort of your fears and your anxieties and your attempts to control your life and so forth, and placing them in somebody else's hands. So here again, like in the emptiness thread, I give a lot of caveats about problems that can arise with these practices, right? So, again, there's kind of the spiritual emergency type problems, but then, in particular with this last one, there's all sorts of problems around the ethics and abusive gurus and communities and so forth that I talk about in there. I just want to like here just briefly say that the book is not advocating any particular religion, and the whole ethos of the book is about like you yourself designing your own path and being sort of like the master of your own, your own spiritual growth here. And there's a little bit of a kind of a balancing act to be done with regard to this particular practice, giving yourself over to an entity or a being or a person. I think can be quite dangerous, and so I give a lot of advice on how to do that skillfully, and mainly it comes down to really finding, I think, maybe finding the guru within, like finding your own.
The
um,
Sadguru, the Sadguru, the real guru, the one within. By the way, I want to say that hence what you're saying, Pierce, hence the title of the book, Be a Lamp unto Yourself. This was the Buddha's advice to Ananda on his deathbed. Be a lamp unto yourself. So, we all go through, or many of us go through the whole thing of idolizing spiritual teachers and getting gurus and doing whatever they say. But at some point, we have to all become a lamp unto ourselves. And what I just want to add, as far as the book goes, not only is this book great for information about these various paths, but these little boxes you can just once you which you can read a lot of books and get a lot of information, but here you can go to a little box and say, okay, I just read about the emptiness thing. I just read about the heart path. Now I can try to apply it by just going through, and they're all very simple steps. So that's why I really think that this is good because it's experiential. It's not just all ideas about non-duality or devotion or what ideas, but let's bring it into let's embody it through these various practices. And you're right, you don't advocate anything. You're just pointing things out, and people can kind of, be a lamp unto themselves, which I'll tell you, that's the whole story as far as I'm concerned.
yeah, me too.
I have always thought that there is some kind of separation between the mind and the thinking and the body and the feeling. So, with the heart thread, um, can you explain how to move it into your body and move these sensations down out of the mind and not sit there and just tell yourself, now do this, I'm thinking, now do that, but rather being able to feel the pulse of the heart center start to vibrate where the mind is no longer in play at all. It's just strictly the sensation of the vibration that's going through you. That's why I said that transparency before, where you almost feel as though your molecules, your atoms, are just becoming dispersed into the all that is, and you're no longer in a state of form.
Yeah. So what you just described there is a great description of the kind of phenomenology, the kind of sensations that you might experience in your body as you're moving down the emptiness path, right? The kind of the dissolution of the solidity of the body and the mirage-like kind of quality. So so that's kind of like on the emptiness thread, on this oneness thread or this heart path. The instructions in the two meditations that I introduced there, which They both happen to come out of Buddhism, just as examples in this chapter. But they both incorporate the body sensations in the practice. So when you're creating an intention that you're, um, going to send out loving kindness into the world, which you're doing in both of those practices, um, or in Tonglen, when you're also pulling in the suffering of the world and transforming in your body and then pushing it out again. In both cases, you're attuning yourself. It's not. It is you're using your thoughts and words to create an intention and to maintain a focus, to sort of prime yourself to be having these experiences. So they're not focused on just like, eliminating thoughts or pushing thoughts away or anything like that. They're using thoughts skillfully to create this kind of environment for you to have these experiences, but they are instructing you to attend to the sensations of the body, and looking for sensations, of intimacy, of love, of kindness, of wishing well for others. So you're looking in your body for, particularly in the heart center, for in the chest area, for, as you're breathing, looking for warmth, looking for like a glow, looking for like a little buzz, feeling in that area. And some people will find that quite readily. Other people might have to do the practice a while before they're able to attune to it, because they're more kind of up in their thoughts. But eventually, when you start to experience the practice, viscerally and in an embodied way, like that, then the direction is to focus more and more on that dimension, less and less on the thinking dimension, and eventually, presumably, you would be able to just drop into the heart center and exude, metta everywhere without needing the mental prompts in order to make that happen, and just be able to sit in your heart center and push those feelings outwards.
So yes, that's a perfect explanation. When I listen to you, um, I'm hearing you, but the the sound of your words are going down into the gut brain, in my solar plexus area. So I'm reacting rather than thinking about it. I'm not making any mental pictures in my mind. Everything that you're saying has become internally as a reaction that touches in the solar plexus area, which for me is connected to the heart center. And then the heart expresses it. So that's probably the practice that I should stay with, because there's nothing really happening up there when you're explaining this. I'm not trying to analyze it, in other words. I'm just listening and reacting to you through this area down here. And the heart then responds in kind.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to be careful not to give the impression that I'm dismissive of thought or thinking, because I'm an academic, I'm a scholar. That's what I do all day. That's what I'm sort of what my day job is. And I there's a chapter in the book at the end of Lamp, where I'm talking about critical thinking and critically analyzing, some of the pitfalls and shortcomings of Asian spiritual traditions and tradition and spirituality more generally, and having a more sort of cold eye critical view and being able to think about these things, I think, is actually a really important safety net that will keep people from landing in abusive situations or just confusion. So I very much value critical thinking as a really important aspect of humanity and of our whole toolkit. Um, but it's not the only tool in the kit. and some of these practices, these practices can become very mental, where everything is just happening at the level of conception, and that's not what we're talking about here. So in all of these threads, what we're talking about is having visceral, um, deeply experienced shifts in your identity and your reality beyond just the level of like, oh, I think I'm not a self. I've realized philosophically how I'm not a self, or I've realized philosophically how all beings are interconnected on throughout the universe or something like that. But we're actually looking for something deeper than that, a real visceral, experiential, transformative appreciation of these insights. And yeah, for that we do have to dig under thought or go beyond thought. Pick your metaphor, but I would say I do that without sort of denigrating and demonizing thought, because thought's my friend. Thought is really, really, really helpful and protective in many ways. It's just not the only game in town.
Yeah, I'm not trying to demonize it in any way.
Yeah, I didn't think
It's
you were.
just it's not my friend. As soon as I start to think about things, the mind starts to create these um, scenarios that uh, conflict with my dog sense, we'll say, where I can sense good and bad and right and wrong. But as soon as I start to make a mental conversation about it, it no longer has. Uh, um, it takes on a whole different kind of scenario for me. It can get. I start to lose that feeling of confidence down below, and I start to make up things that could go wrong. It moves into areas that are conflicting. So why should I, me personally, because I know there are people with illumined minds. I mean, Gary's mind works beautifully. Your mind works beautifully. For me, and it's always been since I've been a little kid, I'm better off with the feeling out of life rather than the thinking out of life. So I try and just stay in that space, and my life is what it is based on it. I'll leave the planet and I would have had that experience, and that's the way. But I'm sure there are other people out there that do feel similar to the way I am, and don't and understand that their thinking process can create conflicts that they don't need to go through, as long as they stay seated in that heart space, because they'll sense what is right and wrong for themselves. Did I explain
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think so. There's a section in the book where I talk about finding your inner guidance, which I think is similar to what you were just describing, where I'm speaking in the context of discovering your spiritual path, and really kind of um, how to feel for alignment, how to feel for your for intuition that's guiding you, rather than going up to sort of like um, conceptual thinking in order to sort of put the pieces together, but to actually feel what's in alignment for you. I think the kind of things that I talk about in that section are pretty similar to what you were just saying. Um, because when you're thinking through things, you can often, you can fool yourself into believing that something's right for you, and when it's not in alignment in your body. Whereas if you just go to your body and feel it, you'll feel right away that it's out of alignment. So I agree with you, and partially what you might also be talking about is just differences in orientation. I'm hyper intellectual. I've been that way since I was a kid, right? And I always, reading, love school, always researching stuff. Very, very, very much, a lot of skill, a lot of natural talent with thought-based activities. Not everybody's like that, right? And obviously that's not your experience, and obviously it's not that I'm better than you are, or you're better than me.
No,
It's just
no,
differences
right.
between human beings, and some people are more muscular than others. Some people are more flexible than others. Some people are, whatever. Some people feel more deeply than others. Some people think, more kind of abstractly than others. And there's nothing wrong with it. And so, yeah. So I think it's more about finding the path that's right for you than it is about finding the path that's right.
Well, that's all about seekers and finders, and I'm glad you brought that up. And when Gary and I started this, we wanted to show the diversity
Yeah.
that is in this, the spiritual paths all around, and that there is no one way that is the only way kind of
That's right.
thing.
That's right.
So, and you've really brought that up and illuminated us on that. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. I mean,
Yeah.
this is the most important part of our conversation. What you bring to the table here are is multi is diverse ways of approaching. I guess in a way, it's like the finder's course, where people can, test themselves out on different paths and to find the one that resonates for you,
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yes, thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah. I have a metaphor in the book that I like to use, which is the metaphor of ecosystem. And when you have an ecosystem, like the Serengeti is the one that I use metaphorically in the book, right? You need to have the zebras and the hippos and the giraffes and the hyenas and the everybody else, right? You need to have these different creatures each filling their own niche of the ecosystem in order to have a healthy ecosystem. And I would say there's metaphorically there's something analogous with spirituality. If there really was just like one and only, if there was one spiritual realization that was the only real one and everything else was bogus, and everybody else was misguided. I mean, that's, to me, that's fundamentalism, and a true spiritual, true spirituality would be more like an ecosystem where difference and diversity was celebrated instead of denigrated. And we could look around and just be like, wow, it's amazing that this person discovered this and this other person discovered that, and there's all these different ways of being spiritual and all of these different kinds of experiences that can be had. Now there's a danger then that some people are just going to sort of like stay conceptual and never actually really experience viscerally the kinds of experiences that we're talking about. Um, so we want to both kind of value diversity, but then also like push people to really kind of really take it seriously and discover their strengths and their orientations, and then really go with that and really try to actually see what this is all about underneath just the concepts and philosophies. So it's kind of I think both are priorities: diversity and also more rigor or more kind of enthusiasm in your exploration.
So let's move on to the next thread.
Yes. So the next thread, I call it energy actually in both books because that's just the best word for it, I think. So either the path of energy, exploring the path of energy, or exploring the energy thread. And so this is referring now to a whole other cluster of spiritual practices and traditions that don't start with the head, the non-dual perception, or the heart, but they really start with the body and the energy system of the body, and working with that as the primary kind of entree into awakening experiences. So here we're talking about traditions like those from India, that the tantric systems that really focus on subtle energy manipulation and kundalini in particular. We're talking about forms of Taoism, and then offshoots of that like martial arts and energy-based medicine systems. And in these cases, they're focused on opening up the energy system of the body, and it's going to become a non-dual kind of path, or a the distinction between self and just the separate self and the universe is also going to disappear along this thread as it deepens. So, like the other threads, it starts with kind of a more superficial. Sometimes it can be quite deep, but usually it's more on the superficial end of the thread, and then it deepens over time. Although, as I said before, people can bounce around and have quite deep experiences early on. But the idea here is, that initially it's the opening of the energy in the body, and it's like I have Kundalini in my body, and it's creating certain bodily symptoms that I'm managing, or something like that. And from there, as it deepens, there's a sort of a dissolving of the boundaries of the bodies until there's no longer really a inside and outside, and it's just kind of like a broader energetic field that is sort of inside and outside gets the distinction gets obliterated, and there's just energy within this field. At this stage, you're still kind of like observing energy, like I'm here observing energy over there. So there's still that kind of separation, which then eventually collapses when the observation of the energy becomes as energetic as the energy that was being observed. So the whole field now is buzzing, pulsating, kind of coming in and out of existence, flashing in and out of existence at a very sort of rapid rate. People will put all kinds of different language, different kinds of terminology, different kinds of ideas on this sort of experience. But in general, the experience is something like, everything that's solid, everything that was previously seen as solid is now seen as being dynamic, almost even not arising. Like it dissolves before it arises. It's people will use the word potential. There's just only potential energy. There's nothing ever actually emerges, because it's always only just the potentiality that's there. Lots of different ways of describing this, but the main idea is the the potency, the kind of energetic quality of the universe at the most kind of nanoscale, until every single particle, every single experience, including the observer, is dissolved into that kind of energetic quality.
There are dangers in this particular thread. Do you talk
Sure.
about it in the book? I mean, there are dangers in Kundalini practice, raising, that energy up without the purity that's needed for that. It
Right.
seems that the practice of Qigong is more subtle and can be used properly, that have less dangers to it. But do you mention the dangers in your book about Kundalini practice?
Yeah, in every chapter of the lamp that where I introduce a set of practices, I always will have a section on the potential dangers, and that's something I talk about in this book a lot. There's both physical dangers, mental health dangers. A lot of my scholarly research is on spiritual emergencies, and a lot of that has to do with
Oh.
energetic type symptoms that people experience. And so, yeah, in the book, I don't give detailed practice instructions about any of these threads. They're just like we were saying earlier, introductory kind of tasters. And in this case, in particular, for this thread, the practices that I introduce are very subtle, very basic kinds of just starting points. I think it's true for all of the threads, but this one in particular, I think it would be best to, if you kind of feel connected with it, feel resonant towards it, that you would want to sort of get yourself steeped in a formal training system that really introduces this in a more systematic way. Before we get into any of the individual threads, there's a chapter that talks about the there's a handful of kind of basic practices that I think people should have under their belt before they take up spirituality in general. And these are focused on well-being, on just like health and well-being. And it's actually, I think these practices are probably what most people are actually looking for out of spirituality. And so in the book, I said, I have this metaphor running of like, we're going on an exploration, we're going on a hike, we're going on a camping trip. And so I say in the book, like, if that's what you're looking for is health and wellness, this is all you need. Just do these practices, adopt them as your lifelong kind of, spiritual tools. And you don't need to proceed any further with the book into any of the other deeper practices. And these practices are mindfulness. Mindfulness for health and stress reduction is one. The second one is grounding practice for your body, just being able to down regulate, just be able to bring yourself back into your body and relax when you're feeling overstimulated or overcharged. And then there's the basic practice of ethical kindness and nonviolence and non-harm. And then finally, sort of a philosophy of going with the Tao. So not just going with the flow and not contradicting or going against your nature or against the nature of things. So these kind of 4 practices, I would say, are great advice for basically anybody in any kind of situation to take on and to embrace. And then, they're not going to lead to profound. They're probably not going to lead to some kind of profound potentially destabilizing sort of spiritual experience. But over the long term, they're really going to bring a lot of reduction of suffering, reduction of stress, and more happiness and well-being in your life. So yeah, so I think most people are actually looking for that, and they should just do that and not move to the more advanced practices that do involve deconstruction of the narrative self or the ego self and getting into more potentially dicey territory and mystical experiences and other things that can be destabilizing. So in chapter 3 of the book, I introduced these kind of basic practices that are good for health and wellness and so forth. And in that section, one of the primary things that I talk about there is grounding practices for your body to help you sort of, bring yourself back into your body and to reduce or dissipate kind of energetic overwhelm that can happen. And I think that is really a really important starting point for the energy thread, just to really have that grounding practice in your toolkit. You've practiced it for many months or many years. And then if these kind of, more overwhelming energy experiences start to happen, you have a tool to help to manage that. So I think that's really important safety advice if you're going to get into any of these. But then in the energy chapter, the practices that I introduce are quite gentle, very, very simple practices to get you sort of to awaken your awareness of the fact that you have kind of an ocean of body sensations that's taking place within your body, and to attune to that, to have a little more interoception, being able to experience and feel, the world of body sensations. And so here I introduce some practices that I call moving meditations, which is just adjusting the meditation posture, either seated or lying down or standing up. And, whereas previously in other exercises, I would have instructed people, in the grounding practices in particular, just do belly breathing and relax. Now you're doing belly breathing with relaxation, but also just a little bit of micro movements, just kind of like accentuating the pleasure that you feel in your body as your breath comes in and out, and kind of moving your hips and your spine just a little bit to sort of like open up the space. And you're paying attention to the the body sensations and trying to really maximize the pleasure that you feel in your body, the physical bliss that you feel in your body by doing that. So a couple different ways of doing that are introduced in the book. And
It
then
sounds
there's a little,
like uh, it sounds like this is almost a precursor for all of the threads to relieve daily stress that's in the body. Uh, there may be some exercises, I'm not sure because the book's not out yet, but there could be exercises in the book in that body section that can alleviate the stress that one feels before they actually get into the other practices.
so the basic grounding practices are in chapter 3, which is like the introductory practices that everybody should do that are for primarily for health and wellness. You know, you don't need to get into any other deeper practices. Just, do these and be happy. So um, I agree. I think that it can be quite helpful to have this sort of in your basic repertoire, no matter who you are. But then for specifically opening up the energy thread, if you want to open up the energy path, of spirituality, rather than give people sort of detailed practice instructions on how to do a whole qigong routine or how to do a whole yoga routine or whatever, I just give them this very sort of like introductory kind of taster for just just feeling your body, because I think a lot of people will encounter the energy chapter and they'll say, oh, I can't feel energy, so I don't know what this book's talking about. So actually, I spent some time at the beginning of the chapter just saying, of course you feel energy. Everybody feels energy, because the word energy or chi or prana, these Asian terms that are translated with the word energy, it's really just referring to the sort of the swirling body sensations that are taking place within your body, and you may only pay attention to them when they get really intense, but they're always there at a very subtle level, sort of like swirling around, and all you have to do is really attune yourself to paying attention to them. And so this really sort of basic starting point is how do you kind of develop the skill to look inside and feel what's actually happening in your body, and not think about like, oh, my quadriceps or my um, my lower abdomen, think in terms of these kind of like physical chunks, but rather to just feel it as a whole sort of swirling kind of like bubble bath kind of sensation that's very fluid throughout the body. So moving towards that is the intention of these practices. And then the separation, like, oh, this part of my body sensation field is, this part of it is my blood vessels, but this other part of it is my shirt against my shoulder, and this other part of it is the AC blowing on my neck, right? That's having a very separated kind of like congealed and condensed kind of perception of these different aspects of the body sensations. And what I'm trying to do is get you towards a space where they're all sort of like swirling together and intertwined and more fluid, rather than blocky, kind of like chunky, right? Separate. It's more just like feeling the entire field of sensations inside the body. And then, as I was saying, then that the boundary of the body collapses, and what you get is a whole field of sensations that is beyond, both inside and beyond the body at the same time.
The
And
transparency.
yeah, and so that is kind of the goal of a couple of the two other practices that are in this chapter. So it's the the use of so so far you're just kind of like in a stable posture, just kind of gently kind of accentuating the breathing in order to sort of feel the fluidity of the body sensations. And then I introduce the intentional movement of the hands in order to actually pull up the energy through the core of the body and then bring it back down through the core of the body to sort of get a little bit of a circulation going up and down, pulling down from, from light, down from the heavens is it's the way the Taoists would talk about it, and down into the earth, and then pulling up from the earth and out into the crown of your head. So just a simple cycle like that, using your arms to direct that. So that's one practice, and then there is also a practice in this chapter having to do with erotic sensations in your body. So how to focus on, it's not an instruction. Again, not very deep, kind of detailed instructions, but sort of drawing some principles from Tantric sexuality or from Taoist sexuality, and being able to find the subtle sensations related to erotic pleasure, and being able to sort of circulate those through your body as well. So those are the four practices introduced in the energy chapter of Lamp Unto Yourself. So just really, really basic beginner teasers for what are, like you were saying, very complicated, very complex practices, and this is just a way to get started.
Wasn't there one more thread?
Right. So the final thread, I allude to it in Lamp Unto Yourself. I don't get into it as a thread. It's in the next book that it's going to become, that it is a more prominent feature. So the next book, The Threads of Awakening, is the little 50-page kind of teaser of that book is available on the multidharma.net website. And so it does have a description of the fourth thread, the psyche thread. This thread, like I was saying earlier, this is about sort of unpacking the shadow material and the unconscious, the conditioning and so forth that, certain spiritual traditions value. I allude to it in the Asian traditions in Lamp, but there aren't really widely accessible Asian practices that relate to this material without going through some kind of initiation or some kind of empowerment ceremonies or some other kind of formal joining of a lineage. So I don't cover them in detail in that book, because that book is really about sort of widely available practices that are open for anybody to do.
It seems that last thread, everybody needs to kind of touch on that before starting the other threads. It almost feels like a clearinghouse for getting all the stuff, the psychological mishmash out of your system while you're working on the other four threads, or one of the other four threads.
Yeah. So now we're kind of moving into the territory of the second book. There's a second book will kind of pick up where the other book left off and kind of move forward. I do want to distinguish between awakening oriented practices versus healing oriented practices. They're different in the same way that there's kind of healing oriented grounding practices, but then there or healing oriented energy practices. Like you can do acupuncture and Reiki and other kinds of energy work as a healing modality. And that's one thing, but I'm talking about, in that chapter, I'm talking about energy work as an awakening practice, right? Which is a different thing. So, in Asian traditions, you have physicians and healers that are doing one, and then you have, spiritual masters and spiritual teachers that are doing the other. Sometimes they're doing both, but often it's like quite separate realms. And I would say the same applies in all the to the other threads as well. There's sort of like more practical applications to some of them, and then there's like the awakening facet, or the awakening practices. So the psyche thread definitely has a healing, or the psyche is definitely used in healing practices, right? Like so obviously psychology, there's all kinds of other therapies, there's all sorts of other kinds of techniques for helping with trauma, helping with other sorts of symptoms and so forth. And that's different than an awakening tradition, or a spiritual tradition focused on awakening that is based on the psyche. So there we're talking about in terms of things that are widely available, things that are part of the sort of mainstream spiritual repertoire in English, for most people. I think we're mainly talking about things that are coming out of Jungian inspired systems. We could be talking about shamanism and some other kinds of indigenous religions that really engage with shadow material, right? Like they talk about them differently than Jungian systems, but they're maybe using terms like soul retrieval, or even exorcism or things like that, but they're focused on sort of the rectifying the psyche in a way, but not for purposes of just healing, but for purposes of spiritual enlightenment and awakening. And so here, the thread is similar to the others, that it can open with more superficial kinds of experiences, and then it deepens into becoming more and more of a type of non-duality. And so here, on the psyche thread, it 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 starts with kind of the realization, oh, there's this part of me that I've been suppressing or repressing, or have been alienated from, or have held it at bay, or whatever, that I've done out of fear, or out of some other kind of negative stance on this part of me. And that part of me has come up, and now I see it, now I experience it, and I have like reconciled it and brought it into my whatever my view of myself is, and I've incorporated it and allowed it to be here, and allowed it to speak, and allow it to express itself in all of its messiness. Um, and then the thread would proceed with more and more and more of the material coming up, until there's an integration of all of that into kind of a larger self, or a larger sphere, or a more complex, more multifaceted kind of self. And ultimately, the the non-duality that takes place here is that ultimately the relationship between you and your shadow material, or you and your conditioning, changes. So it's no longer like there's me and then there's my conditioning, or there's me and there's my shadow material, but rather the whole sphere gets integrated into one kind of non-separated entity, which is often expressed as something like, I realize how everything is conditioning, even the ego, right? Or I realize how everything is being driven by unconscious processes, even what I previously thought of as myself. The psyche thread ends with the realization that everything is the unconscious expressing itself. Everything is created or manifested out of my unconscious material.
With that said, can't we just change the nomenclature where the words therapy and healing kind of derive a fixing of yourself kind of thing, where the word awakening is such a positive sounding word, which is a blossoming of our true nature, you know? It's less a psychological thing and more an opening of our true nature kind of thing. And it just mentally it draws you into a more of a positive mindset than thinking about therapy or healing or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm a little bit personally allergic to the term true nature because the word true implies that other views are false, and so I'm not saying that you necessarily were meaning it that way, but
I wasn't meaning it that way. I was,
when you
yeah,
have true, you give birth to a false, and so my
fair
my
enough.
my focus is always just on the phenomenology, on the experiencing, not the underlying, philosophy or truth or model of the universe. So I wouldn't use that term, but I like what you're saying though. I would maybe say, if you want to say that the some of these techniques can be used for fixing the self, other tech, sometimes the same techniques or other techniques or related techniques can be used for um, for going beyond the self, the limited self, that the ego self or the narrative self, right? So some these techniques can be used to fix that narrative self, that ego self, or they can be used to sort of, go beyond or transcend or enfold that narrative self into a larger whole. Um, so I do think there's a distinction between those two goals, even if the practices might look the same in some cases.
Maybe I should have used the terminology, uh, the soul's true nature rather than our personal human self. I, you're right. True is, you know, kind
Yeah.
of,
So I mean, so here we're gonna start playing a game where I'm gonna object to any formulation. I not object. I mean, you can use whatever language you want, Stefan. That's perfectly fine with me. But for me, I don't use language that implies an underlying reality of one kind or another. Because if you say, "Oh, the soul's true nature," then you are not speaking from the emptiness thread, because the emptiness thread will clearly result in the experience that there is no soul, that there could not be a soul, that the word soul is just a concept, right? The emptiness thread, that's what they would say. That's what somebody in the emptiness type experience would say about the word soul, right? And in Buddhism, it's like one of the foundational principles, anatta, is like there is no persistent essential self of any kind, right? So it's literally like no atman is what it means, right? So it's yeah. So, but on the other hand, finding your soul's true purpose sounds very much like what you'd be doing in the psyche thread, or finding, like, merging your own separate self with the global soul, or the global, the oversoul, or the God, soul, might be what you're doing in the oneness thread.
well,
So different.
I wish I could have said it the way you just said it. Then I wouldn't have had to listen to you contradict me.
Um, yeah, it's just, but it's quite common for every person who's in a particular tradition to adopt the language of that tradition and adopt the philosophies of that tradition, adopt the worldviews of that tradition, right? And so what I'm trying to do is create like an umbrella where it's like neutral ground, so that no one tradition gets to set the terms for what's going to be reality, right? Or to set the terms for what's the ultimate truth, because these traditions disagree with each other. And so if you're going to combine them, you have to be agnostic, I think, with in terms of what the underlying ultimate truth is, right? So I don't use words like absolute, ground of being, soul, like these kinds of like, these terms that will want to fix what the underlying ultimate reality is. I tend not to use those terms, because I want to create that sort of fertile ground for combination, on equal terms.
But you would admit that Otis Redding was one of the great soul singers of our time.
Oh, that kind of soul, absolutely, yeah. That kind of soul, I'm down with, yeah. Uh,
I'm
Yes.
glad I got that in on this podcast.
And no, and I have no objection to other people using that kind of language. Like if for you, the word soul really resonates and it really means something, very meaningful and important, or somebody else wants to use the word absolute, or God or what have you, like I'm fine with, and I'm fine with people speaking their own truth in their own way. I'm perfectly fine with that. I'm just saying, for me, when I'm articulating something, I won't use that kind of language because of the philosophical implications that I don't want to necessarily take on. What do you guys think? You
The beauty of silence. We didn't talk about silence yet. Isn't that a thread? Oh, the sitting, the sitting thread is part of silence.
Yeah, I think sort of the quieting of the mind can happen in all of the threads, with a certain level of kind of withdrawal from thinking in concepts and going into the experience, right? In the emptiness, it could be like going into this kind of like deep void, deep tranquility. In the oneness thread, you can have in these kind of immersive unity experiences, the mind just totally drops away, and you could call that silence. In the energy thread, there's again the kind of most immersive versions of the experience. Your mind is kind of obliterated by this sparkling, pulsating kind of energetic field. That one maybe silence is because the 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 energy is like popping, so it's quite active, but there's silence every time it pops and disappears before it comes back into existence. There's like a a little bit of silence there.
Well, you know what John Cage discovered at the Harvard, I don't know what it's called, the Harvard lab that studies silence. They came to the conclusion that there is, like this is what you're saying, there is no such thing.
Yeah.
There is no silence. There's always something going on.
Yeah. So yeah, different threads will could have different kinds of answers to the question about to some really basic questions, or different ways that certain kinds of experiences are had, right? You know, silence, richness, bliss, fear, like all of these threads can interpret them differently and have something, a little different phenomenology around them.
When one of the things that we didn't cover in your book and your new book, which I think is perhaps the most important thing of all, is, and you allude to this in your book, don't reify.
Mm.
Don't reify. That's the key, because all these things are just concepts. Silence, soul, this, that, ground of being, whatever, absolute. These are just ideas. Don't reify. Let everything be as it is without the overlay, the superimposition of mental ideas about it. What does absolute mean? Does anybody know? So again, don't reify. Don't make things, or don't make something out of nothing. That's one of the takeaways I got from your book.
Yeah, and that's yeah, for sure, and that's the difficulty with talking about this in language like we're doing right now, is that language, by definition, reifies, right? Like every single sentence, every single word is a reification of something, and so, right. So you're always going to be kind of dissatisfied with the use of language to try to convey some of these experiences because of the conceptualization, the abstraction, the reification that takes place every time you open your mouth. So yeah, good reminder to put that in every.
We can't get away from it because we're talking, but it's a good thing to keep it in mind that, like, what I'm saying, no matter what it is just a story. It's whether no matter what, whether it's about story about God or about the soul or about the psyche or about the anything or even the body, it's just a story. So when you have, and this is where we're kind of like what's going on for me is like I know that what I'm saying is just a story, yet I know also that don't reify, don't make something out of nothing, you know. So it's a story, but don't make it real. In other words, it is what it is, and we can communicate as best we can, which we're trying to do. But again, this whole thing of reification, that to me is something always to keep in the background, so you don't believe your own story, kind of thing.
Yeah. I don't know how far down this rabbit hole we want to go. So I agree with you. And then I would also add that the negation of something is also a reification of it. So to say my story is real, like the story I'm telling, like all of these, concepts are real, that obviously that's reification. But then to say they're not real is also a reification. It's a reification of the negation, right? The reification of their absence, right? You're taking a position that there's a universe in which these things are not true. I think it's best not to either assert or negate, because doing so is going to reify the position. So it's not to say, previously I was saying I don't use terms like ground of being or the absolute or so forth because they reify, but I'm not saying there is no ground of being, there is no absolute, because that would equally be a reification. So you're left with, I mean, if you actually want to be truthful, you're left with just not being able to speak at all, because either you'll reify in the positive or negative every time you open your mouth.
Right, they're both right. As you pointed out, I'm glad you did add that, because they're both extremes. Like
Yeah.
this is one extreme. This is not as an extreme. So you're better off just taking the middle path there, and
So yeah, so the middle path is either.
you're not saying that the absolute, there is no such thing as absolute. You're just not making something out of it.
Yeah. So the middle path would either be the way out of this is either we're just not going to talk, or we're going to communicate and use words, knowing that every time we do, it's inaccurate and it's a reification and it's just a pointer and not the actual thing. I choose the latter. I tend to talk a lot.
Yeah,
And
I choose, and
write
I'm
a
with you.
lot.
I choose the latter too. So, in other words, I'm not going to sit in silence. There's no way, because
Yeah.
that's not who I am. I'm going to open my big mouth. But let's hope and pray that I don't take myself and what I say too seriously. But we have to talk, and I like talking.
Exactly. And we come back to where we started, the first episode of our interview, which was to say that the map is not the territory, right? This is all of this map making, all of this talking is not the actual territory itself.
And the Tao that can be spoken is not the real Tao. The Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. You also allude to that in your section on Taoism.
Yeah.
Well, let's not discount the mystical poets like Aurobindo or Rumi, whose poetic words inspire to such an extent that it can actually move you into these states of transcendence without even doing these practices.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a whole tradition in Tibetan Buddhism of, pointers where people will, it's not necessarily so focused on poetics, but it is also focused on sort of directly leading people into having a certain kind of experience, just based on the skillful use of words. Yeah, so words can, they can point, um, and that can be, they can only point, and that can be an exercise in futility, but it also every once in a while could actually be quite helpful for some people in certain situations. So
And not to go off on
it's
a
worth
tangent,
talking.
not to go off on a tangent, this is the last point I'm going to make, that in certain traditions, like let's say non-dual Shaiva Tantra, one of them, words themselves are express are they're not just they're not simply pointers, they are expressions of the, again, fundamental reality or whatever.
Well, let me just wrap it up then by saying you asked about braiding and integrating and releasing the threads. You can edit that out, and I don't have to respond to it then if you want to do it that way.
Well,
Um,
we did want to cover the whole sequence. So
let me wrap it up then with sort of the braiding, integrating, and releasing, which are the last three chapters of the book that's on multidharma.net, so the one that isn't out yet. So here essentially I'm picking up from where Lamp Unto Yourself left off. So Lamp Unto Yourself is for beginners, and it's advocating a DIY approach to these threads, introductory practices for each one of them, get started. And then I'm advocating that you kind of integrate them into your day so that you're spreading yourself across these threads in order to see what you resonate with, in order to see what kinds of practices work for you. Um, if you don't get anything out of some of these practices, then swap them out for others. I sort of talk about how to get started in Lamp Unto Yourself. The second book picks up where that left off and talks about sort of once you are in an awakening process, so you're actually having the results of one or more of these threads in your practice, then where do you go with that? And so these last three chapters are really focused on the long term kind of maturation process, you could say, of a spiritual awakening, going from deepening into the threads that you have open. First of all, there's the opening of the threads, and then the deepening into them, and that's what we've been discussing. But then as you move forward, you might have more than one thread open. You might be working with different kinds of practices. You might be experiencing things in your awakening process that are coming from different threads. And the chapter on braiding is I'm talking about when you feel like you're oscillating between different things. Like right now, I have a lot of oneness type experiences, and then like 6 months from now, I have a lot of emptiness type experiences, and then I have a Kundalini awakening, and then all this sort of like conditioning and past trauma comes up, and this can feel disorienting, and it can feel like I'm sort of like oscillating rapidly between different kinds of things. It can be confusing. People often are looking for help to make sense of their experiences at that point, because just things seem really kind of out of control, out of hand. And so that chapter on braiding is intended to kind of help people make sense of this kind of phase of this process. Of oscillation between these, and the metaphor is of the four threads, obviously kind of braiding together, and at any given moment one of them's on top, right, and then the next moment the other ones come on top, and the braiding process sort of is it's just part of what happens with most people in their spiritual awakenings. If they have more than one thread open, is this kind of like oscillation between them. Integration, the next chapter, then talks about sort of once the braiding process starts to smooth out a little bit, you will often start to have more integrated experiences. And here's where people start to combine the language of the threads together, and maybe some people listening to this whole presentation have been thinking like, this all seems very segmented apart, and for me that's much more integrated together. Well, that would be an indication that maybe you're like further along in this integration process. So the integration process is where people will say things like, I can see that everything's empty, but it's also simultaneously divine, right? Or everything is energetic and it's also simultaneously empty. Some combination of the threads where things are seen simultaneously through the different lenses of those different threads, and you're having experiences that are mixed or blended together. So that's the integration chapter. Um, the final chapter about releasing the threads is once things have become so integrated into your experience, once they become totally integrated into your experience, there's no longer the need or the habit or even the possibility of kind of separating out again those frameworks, and holding it up as something unique or distinct. At that point, the whole kind of significance of the thread, the whole significance of the awakening process related to that thread, the whole significance of all of the experiences associated with that thread just kind of seems to collapse. And so for somebody who, maybe has spent, decades in an awakening process, suddenly might say something like, all my all of my interest in awakening and all of my awakening experience seems to have just like disappeared, and I'm just like an ordinary person again, and none of it matters anymore. And that's kind of like the release of the threads, the end of the journey, the kind of, you know the insignificance of the awakening process, and the sort of falling away of the whole thing. Okay, so that was just a quick little
Yeah, but
summary of what those
it was
chapters
a
hold.
beautiful summation, and you covered everything really well. Because I said, how's he going to fit braiding, integration, and release into a little capsule? But you did it. I thought it was perfectly clear. I got it. We're in one accord here.
Great. Well, yeah, and if people, again, if you want to like read more, or get more detail about it, the website multidharma.net has the PDF there, and there's also, there's also other materials soon to come, other kinds of, interviews and recorded materials around that. So, check it out. Yeah.
Good stuff. Great stuff.
Thank you, Pierce.
Yeah. Hopefully it was clear, and I had a lot of fun. So yeah, thank you both for the invitation.